Welcome back to Close Up. It's a summer of getting to know the state primary candidates for voters, and we're checking in with several of those candidates here on Close Up. In the 1st Congressional District, Russell Prescott presents a bit of a quandary for those trying to figure out how that contest will play out. He was late to join the race, but he's been on the ballot in large parts of the district for years as a state senator and an executive counselor. We sat down with Prescott recently at his home in Kingston. So a lot of people know you on the Seacoast. You've been running for office for a long time, whether it's state senate or executive council, but going to a more statewide race in the 1st District, there are people you have to introduce yourself to. So who are you and why are you running for Congress?
Sure thing. Russell Prescott, of course. And I am a small businessman here in Exeter. I live in Kingston, where we're at today. And my business has been thriving for many years. My father started it, and my brother and I, for over 35 years, grew it from just 7 to 10 people all the way up to 50 people is what we have today. So we've increased the job opportunities in Exeter, and with that hard work. Also at the same time, I did public service, which I ran for office as early as 1998 and ran for the Senate. And because of an income tax, we had the problem of people wanted an income tax, and we know that's not the right way to go. So I was elected to stop the income tax, and that's what I did. And we had a deficit, and we corrected the deficit to surplus. So they have that experience. And you know, he asked me why I'm running for office. I think that experience shows that I'm the one that's really the most incapable of becoming the next Republican congressman and being able to do the most for New Hampshire because of my experience.
Let's talk about some issues. Obviously, yet another tragic mass shooting in America, this one in Highland Park. We can go down, the list is long and still growing now, from Uvalde. All of these tragedies repeating over and over again. We know you're a strong gun rights and Second Amendment advocate from your time in Concord, but what, if anything, should Congress be doing to stop this scourge on American life?
Well, certainly with the mental health conditions of people, we need to make sure there's plenty of funding, and that's one of the highest priorities and needs of our country and has been in our state. And I've had the experience of making sure we've bolstered those pieces of legislation that needed to be done at the time, and also the spending that needed to be done at that time of my times that I was in the executive council. We were spending money, making sure it was targeted to mental health. We need to continue to do that. And the family, to make sure that the families stay strong, that's what the economy is all about. We got to make sure that we have a strong economy, so we have a strong backbone of support system for all individuals. The family is most important. We got to make sure that we do keep taxes low. We do keep the emphasis on where's the best place to spend the money, and that would be on mental health.
What about something like expanded background checks? Would you support those?
I would not support something that is against the Constitution of our United States and the Constitution of New Hampshire. But to talk about more changes there, I would first concentrate on mental health.
You mentioned the Second Amendment, obviously a fundamental right in this nation. It seems like it was dealing with, in a way, a different reality of a more responsible gun culture in the United States. Even though that fundamental right still exists, we have a lot of people who just are not meeting that standard of not just being responsible firearms owners, but not being a danger to the public, inflicting these mass casualty events. So what to do, even within mental health, if that's where you're going to act? What specifically can be done to stop these individuals before they act?
It's difficult to stop a person before they act, but there are telltale signs where if you do have close contact as in the departments of the police and departments of the sheriff's department, close contact with our constituents, with the people every day, that's most important, to be involved with people's life in a deep, deep way in our community.
What should Congress be doing about the high cost of energy and price inflation generally?
Well, first of all, you got to get to the point where people are willing to expand their business, and that's, if the economy is bad all around because of high gas prices, not many people are going to be expanding their businesses. In terms of energy, it goes the same way. If people are not going to have a return on their investment, or if regulation is going to take over and stop them from getting a return on investment, we can have all the leases in the world that are available for people to drill or to explore. But if the future doesn't look good for energy in terms of coal and oil, that is not going to happen. They will not take the money and put it into a new refinery if they know the future is going to be against them.
On the abortion issue, you're running as a pro-life Republican. When you were at the State House, you were known as a bit more of a moderate. So should strongly pro-life Republicans be skeptical of how you would be on this issue in Washington?
When you are a pro-life person, also compassionate to the needs of our state, sometimes they intersect. With Planned Parenthood, they were the sole source of a contract that needed to be awarded for HIV testing. And if they were the only choice, I did vote for that because the needs of our state intersect between my pro-life position and the needs of our state.
You said in the wake of the Dobbs Supreme Court decision that you believe abortion is now a state issue as that decision dictates. But if you're in Congress in the next term and there's a Republican majority, would you be voting in favor of something like a late-term abortion ban if it comes up?
I would leave all of the things in charge of the people that get elected by the people of New Hampshire. And that would be states' rights in our Constitution, the 10th Amendment. I'd take that stand to make sure that the closest contact and who's going to be making the decision is closest to the people. And that would be the state legislature and also our governor and the state senate and in the House of Representatives.
So essentially you would be voting no on that?
Yes, I would. I want to make sure the states have the final say because it's the closest responsibility to the people is in Concord, not in the federal government. They're not as close.
You know, a lot of people have been watching these January 6th hearings that are going on in Congress and learning more about what happened. Have you been watching any of the January 6th hearings so far?
I have not. I have not done that. I've been concentrating on my campaign for sure. And you know, when you look at Washington and you see its dysfunction, you know for a fact that something new and something different has to take place in Washington. That's why I'm running for office. For so many years, I was trained by those people that are elected by the people of New Hampshire. You know, by working side by side with people in the House of Representatives and also in the Senate and also in the executive branch, I know that New Hampshire has great ideals and they have worn off on me. And I want the people to know that there's dysfunction in Washington, but I will not be part of it. I will get down there and I will work, as I have worked 10 years in the Senate and 4 years in the Executive Council, to be pragmatic and do the right thing and learn to do the right thing.
In these hearings, the former Attorney General Bill Barr testified that he believed it seemed that then President Trump had, quote, detached from reality over his claims of election fraud in the 2020 election. Do you think that given that kind of testimony and what we've heard in these hearings, that former President Trump should still be the standard bearer of the Republican Party?
Again, I've been concentrating on my campaign, and I can say this, that as an executive counselor, I did vote to accept the votes that came in from New Hampshire. I don't know how other states run that, but in New Hampshire, we have a lot of checks and balances on our election system, and we got to make sure our election system is one of the strongest and soundest in the world, and I'll continue to work that way as I did in the Executive Council.
What do you say to a rank-and-file GOP voter who comes up to you and says, hey, we need to stop the steal, we need to look into what the president has said about the 2020 election? Absolutely.
Look into whatever is a concern to the people of New Hampshire. I will do that.
But do you think there's any merit to those claims?
We can find out by investigating, for sure.
So there are some very youthful and energetic candidates in this race, and you represent, in style and substance, someone more experienced, obviously. How do you make the case to those primary voters? If they're looking at this field and say, I might want to go with somebody younger, why you?
Because for the last 24 years, I've been preparing for this time to become a congressman, being influenced by the people of New Hampshire and making decisions for their benefit. And we have now in New Hampshire the best economy in New England. We have the ability to continue if we keep on the track of being fiscally responsible. And I have that track record. It's proven that I'm a fiscal responsible person, and I will continue to do that if elected to go to Washington.
Councilor Prescott, thanks for joining us on Close Up.
Yes, you're welcome.